All right, this is a review of how to do factoring by grouping. So if I look at this problem right here, I have 4 terms. And my first thing I'm always going to do is look for a GCF, a greatest common factor. But when I look at these 4 terms, there is not a coefficient, right? Coefficient here is 1, -5, -2, and 10. I don't have anything other than 1 that divides into all of those coefficients, all those numbers. And when I look at my letters, I have an X and a Y here, an X, and no letter. So I don't have any GCF, either number-wise or letter-wise, that I can pull out of each of the 4 terms. So instead, I'm going to try to look at it in groups of 2. So I'm going to start by looking at this first group of 2. So I'm just going to look here at xy minus 5y. And I'm going to look and see, is there a greatest common factor I can pull out from just these 2 terms? Yeah, there's a y. This term has a y and this term has a y. So I can pull out a y and I divide each term by y, right, which cancels out. I get x minus 5. Now, that is just this. I still have this part over here. So when I look at that piece, same thing. I am going to look at just these 2 terms here. So I've already done these 2. Now I'm looking at these 2. I'm grouping these 2 together. So if I just look at these 2, I can see that I have a -2. Remember that what determines if my GCF is positive or negative is the first term. And because I'm looking at just these 2, my first term is negative. So that means my GCF is negative. So I'm now going to divide both of these by 2. And if I had grouped this, I could have kind of put parentheses. Remember, there's a plus in the middle there, though. All right, so now I've got this. My GCF is -2. So the -2 has to come out. That's where that comes from. And that's same, I can cross out. So I have -2. Negative by negative is a positive, so that leaves me with a positive x. Positive by negative is a negative. So again, how I got to this step, I looked at just the first 2 and I saw that my GCF was y. And so I took a GCF out of the first 2 terms and I got this part in red. Then I looked at the second 2 terms and I said, or the last 2 terms, and I saw I could pull out a -2. So I divided each term by -2. That's my GCF of -2, and that's what I get. And here's how I know that grouping has been successful, is I have the same thing in the parentheses. I have x minus 5 and x minus 5. So really what I'm doing here is I'm saying, oh, I have something multiplied by something minus something multiplied by something. I'm multiplying here. That means, really, this whole thing here is like another GCF. I'm going to pull it out. I've got x minus 5 because it's in both terms, right? Because terms are things that are separated by a plus or minus. So this is one term, this is the second term. I can take this out. When I do, I get y minus 2 left behind, right? Again, what I'm really doing here is saying, okay, divide by x minus 5, divide by x minus 5. That means there's an x minus 5 on the outside. Same, cancels out. I have x minus 5 on the outside, and on the inside I have y minus 2. This is my answer. If I multiply it out, I will get back to my original problem. So let's try one more of these. Let's try x squared plus 4x minus x minus 4. So again, we'll try this example 2. This was example 1. I look at all 4 of these terms and I can see that I don't have a GCF that I can pull from all. They don't all have x's. That one does not have an x, so I can't pull out an x. And this is a coefficient of 1. So I don't have any GCF other than 1. We don't normally say I have a GCF of 1 because 1 is a factor of everything. So again, I'm going to look at it in groups of 2. Now, in this case, I look at these first 2 terms, right? We're just looking at the first 2. So I'm going to say just these first 2. I have an x squared and an x. So I have a GCF of x, which gives me x squared divided by x 4x divided by x. There's my first two terms broken down. Now I look at my next two terms here. And again, the fact that there's a negative means I have to at least pull out a GCF of -1. There's nothing else I can pull out. There's an x here, but no x there. That has a coefficient of 1. That's -4. So I don't have a number or a letter other than -1. So I am going to say, okay, this becomes -1. And I'm going to divide everything by -1. So I have -1. And actually, I should have left my negative in there. It should be plus, there we go, negative. -1 on the outside, that term was negative. So I have -x divided by -1 is positive x. -4 divided by -1 is positive 4. So again, in case it was hard to see what I did here, this is what I had. I had -x minus 4, and I was trying to see my GCF. We said the GCF was -1, so I divided everything by -1, and that's how I got to this step right here. So now I can see again I have the same thing in my parentheses, so I can write that x plus 4, and then what's left is x minus 1. Now be careful, this case I actually had a negative, so I knew I had to pull out a -1. But for example, on these kinds of problems, if I had something like this, if my problem had been x plus 4, and then I had plus x plus 4 left, I still have to pull out a GCF because I need to have that second number that goes in my second binomial. So even though we don't normally say I'm pulling out a GCF of 1, in this case I actually want to say, okay, there's a 1 there. Let's write the invisible 1 and say, okay, I've got a GCF of 1, because then when I go through and do this, I have x plus 4, x plus 1. It should always be a binomial times a binomial. So just, again, be aware of that. Make sure you have the 1 there if there's nothing else to pull out, because you do need to have the 1 right there.